do business with people they like. And so building those relationships and building a community feel where people feel, hey, I need some help.
Nothing beats getting in the room together and just throwing stuff up on a whiteboard and seeing what sticks and what slowly slides off as you investigate it further.
It's one thing to be able to say, hey, we know what the issues are. It's something entirely different to be able to say, and here's what the really smart CEOs are doing about it.
This week's Mind Behind has Ted Miller on again. Now, he's going to become a regular guest. I can see this. This is his second time. The last time we spoke about AI in law, just kind of what the impact was going to be. But this one's really different. This one, we're going to talk about the Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius, and the book, Meditations and Why It's Important Now. How did we come to this? A personal discussion with Ted just about what leadership influences were now, how they maybe were well grounded. We're talking about new technology, but we're kind of keeping on coming back to maybe very traditional values and processes and approaches more than processes, actually. Give a bit of a background of Ted. He's got a Bachelor of Laws, Bachelor of Economics. He's lectured political science at the University of Sydney and the University of Newcastle. He was a barrister and general counsel. Really well-rounded, and he's also an author of 3 books, and he's currently writing The Catholic Moment, Ideas, Power, and the Catholic Resurgence in the West. This is something that's passionate for Ted, and that's probably really important when we're talking about something like this. Now, Marcus Aurelius, just to give a very quick background, was an emperor 2,000 years ago, but it seems to his name comes up regularly when we're seeing quotes and kind of maybe approaches to leadership. He's regarded as the philosopher king within the Roman Empire. And we're going to look at the influences of philosophy and Stoicism and how that plays a part even when technology seems to be driving human behavior and processes within business in a slightly different way. Let's look at what the influence is still there and how we can use it. Enjoy the chat. I've been looking forward to, you know what, Ted, we seem to plan these things and they take a while to come together, don't they? Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Graham.
All right, we're going to talk, and we're going off what we normally do on the Mind Behind, and we're going to kind of focus on some of the influences and influencers of leadership and kind of maybe even how we approach the world nowadays. And we're going to be talking about somebody called Marcus Aurelius. And I'm going to give you all of the credit for this one. For there you go. For coming up with the topic and kind of why we should do it. So I'm going to go straight into this. For somebody who's never heard of Marcus Aurelius, who was he and why should we still care about somebody who lived 2,000 years ago?
Well, people with a general understanding of the history of the Roman Empire will know that after Caesar sparked a civil war, that ended badly, obviously with Brutus and others taking him out in the Senate. And his adopted son, Augustus, then became the first emperor of the empire. Now, Aurelius succeeds. There's a succession of emperors after Caesar Augustus. And Marcus Aurelius becomes the emperor in 161 AD and goes down in history as probably the best example of what in classical philosophy you would call the philosopher king. Now, he was from a noble patrician family, but he was adopted by the preceding emperor as his son, which became the tradition for Roman emperors. They were well aware that if you simply handed off the job to a biological heir, that could end in disaster. Edward Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, makes that point that all of the emperors who were the biological heir of the preceding emperors usually were a disaster. So what the emperor would do, he would pick the most suitable person and adopt that person as their son. So you have a lot of adoptions of middle-aged men happening, for example. And Marcus Aurelius was one of these. So he was chosen for the role. And coming into the position of being Roman emperor, which is a huge job, his background and his life training had been in the philosophical method. He deliberately chose that as a path in life. And the particular philosophy, which comes from the Greeks, it begins about the 4th century BC, is called Stoicism. We're all familiar with the term. But the key to Stoicism, I can put it most simply this way. If you are a Roman, obviously you're not Christian, you're pagan. So they're pantheists. They believe that the universe is a substance, a logical substance, a rational substance, and they identify that with God or with the realm of the gods. So Romans, Greeks had lots of gods, hundreds of them. So they did believe in the divine order. But pagan religions are ritualistic. They don't necessarily have a system of ethics or values associated with them. So in ancient times, in the classical age, you would get that from the philosophers rather than from your religion. So that's how that space for how you should behave in public life was fleshed out. And Stoicism as a systematic philosophy really has 3 key areas to it. Firstly is the science of reason, which is logic, and has been handed down to us from the ancient Greeks through Aristotle, probably most influentially, but certainly also through the Stoics, very, very importantly. And then there is physics, which is, as it were, the science of understanding whatever your domain of action is. So if you're managing a large corporation, that's your domain of action. And so using logic to rationally understand whatever the proposition is before you, particle physics or running a big corporation, it doesn't really matter. So that's the second element, physics, understanding the world around you. And the third element, the key to it, to being a good person, is ethics. And so we have this metaphor that comes down to us from classical philosophy of the egg. So the outside shell of the egg, the protective covering, is logic and reason. The inside, the white, is your domain of action, the thing that you want to understand. And the core in the middle, the yolk, that keeps you in line and allows you to go through life as a good person, are your personal ethics. So they're the 3 key elements of Stoic philosophy. And they had a particular way of putting these elements together. Aurelius was a serious philosopher. And this was the dominant philosophical framework of the ancient world, and certainly for Romans and also for the Greek people of that period. So that positions him in terms of the history of ideas, as it were.
Stoicism.
Mm.
How did that come about? Who was the original Stoic?
So the original Stoic is Zeno of Cyprus.
They've got great names, haven't they? They've got great names. I wish we had names like that.
Wonderful names, isn't it? He's not the Zeno of the famous Zeno's paradox, but he is one of the most influential philosophers in all history. So he's writing mid-300s BC from Cyprus. He lives to a ripe old age, Zeno. I think he dies around about age 78. And he's very, very prolific, and he is the one that develops this framework. And again, I could put it this way: the dominant philosophical trend at the time for Greeks and for the classical world comes out of Athens. You have Socrates, the philosopher who's famous for never writing anything down. He would put ideas forward by speaking in public. He's put to death for questioning Athenian democracy and supposedly corrupting youth. But it's his pupil Plato who writes down what we know about Socrates and his philosophy. And also then the pupil of Plato is, of course, Aristotle. So they're the 3 dominant figures. And without going into too much detail, there's a certain view of what a human mind can know and the ultimate nature of reality. So we're talking epistemology, if you want to be technical, and metaphysics, that there's a bit of a reaction against, and this is where Stoic philosophy comes in. So it's a different take on the big questions and becomes extremely influential. But it is also rather more practical than the classical tradition of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. By no means am I saying that Aristotle wasn't a practical philosopher. It definitely was, and we could come back to that. But certainly the Stoics, a key focus for them was how to live a good life. And they are probably the strongest contributors to the classical heritage in philosophy that tries to make it very practical and about how you can ensure that you are a good person. Now, being a good person, we should say at this point, the notion of good, it's a commonplace word these days, but in classical philosophy, it's a fundamental concept. So the good is to be in harmony with nature. So to be a good person is to be interested in human flourishing, given the position of a human being in the natural world. I'll give you a quick example. So in fundamental, let's say, Christian ethics, just to pick one example, the sexual ethics of, say, the Catholic Church, which talks about sacramental marriage and sexual activity only occurring within that context, the fundamental underlying justification from that is that that is how you promote human flourishing, by restricting sexual activity to a relationship of that kind. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's basically how the argument runs. And the Stoics were very, very firm on that point. And Meditations, therefore, the book that we are talking about today, and I've got my copy here, is really a diary. So this is Marcus Aurelius as emperor. And as emperor, you are the commander-in-chief. You're ruling an empire of 70, 100 million people, ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse. One of the miracles of the Roman Empire is that it was so multicultural, but managed to maintain cohesion for such a long period of time. You're a statesman, you're a diplomat, you're the military commander, you're the chief legislator, you're the chief judge. So you're an absolute monarch. And Aurelius, because of his background and philosophical training, maintained a diary in which he would entertain self-reflection and self-criticism and write it up as clearly as he could as a self-improvement exercise. And meditation is a collection of those essays that he wrote in that spirit. I don't think they were ever intended by him for publication. So they drift a little bit, but it's a fairly short book. And for anybody who wants to get a good understanding of Stoic philosophy in an applied sense and how it can be useful, it's a highly recommended read, I have to say. Really is.
Why is it relevant now? What brings? I mean, I've looked at a couple of kind of the insights that come from the book, and it seems that there's some real logic. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, you'll find strength. That's probably one of the most famous. And it's the kind of thing we're talking about constantly at the moment with change, with the kind of things that we're dealing with, and in the modern world, the change seems to be coming through at a greater speed than it ever has. But in general terms, why should we be listening to what insights somebody's got on themselves from 2,000 years ago, and probably in a position that most of us can't really relate to? A position of power, a position of strength, a position of intellect.
So here we have a man, Marcus Aurelius, who has the job of Roman emperor, which must be one of the most challenging jobs in all human history. His period as emperor, there were a lot of challenges that he had to confront. There was a lot of military conflict, particularly on the northern border. There were plagues, there were floods, pretty much every problem you could imagine. And he's at the center of all of it. To retain his composure and to not be overtaken by distractive emotions, such as anger, for example, he maintained this interior self-reflection based around those three key propositions. Logic, the science of reason, in order to make sure that you'll make decisions that are based on sound argument and proper investigation. Then focusing on your domain of responsibility, using the logic to properly understand that. So it's about cultivating a rational mind and doing it in a very organized and orderly way in order to maintain your balance, but also constantly examining your own conduct to make sure that your personal ethics are, as it were, up to scratch. One of the amazing things about Aurelius is that most emperors surrounded themselves with a Praetorian Guard for personal safety. He's notable for not having to rely upon that very much at all, because his role as emperor was largely accepted by consensus because of the good example of how he led his own life on a personal level. And so he had that respect. He was understood as being philosophically inclined, but also a very fair ruler. So these habits of mind are as relevant today as they were back in the time of Marcus Aurelius and even prior to that. And if you ask yourself the question in, 2025, where should a person get their guidance in terms of personal ethics, but also in terms of how you can live your life and be a good person, a useful person? You can take it from religion, for example, and the Judeo-Christian tradition, and indeed the Islamic tradition. They offer up a table of values and ethics that people of those religious convictions are expected to follow. But if you're not, you've got to find it somewhere else. And the danger is people could just make it up and just make terrible mistakes. Or you could look at a well-grounded tradition and see what it has to say about those issues. I'll give you an example here. And just to go straight to your question, to tie the ancients back to the current, the leading book that comes from the classical period on ethics is this rather large-looking book here from Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, which is the standard book from ancient times. Now, unless anyone thinks that these books are abstract and dealing with ideas way up there, if you were to open it at book 9, paragraph 9, he's talking about whether a happy person really has need for friends or not. So it gets down to that level of being very, very practical. And he discusses this and he comes to the conclusion, so the happy person needs friends, after considering the argument that, well, no, you don't really. And he comes to the conclusion that you do. So that's Aristotle a couple of thousand years ago. And here we are, Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people. And essentially Carnegie makes the same argument. Now, this all sounds like practical common sense. And on one level it is. But if we don't have books and recognized thinkers that keep reproducing what is accepted through experience as being good common sense, if we lose that, then we lose the benefit of the experience of what's happened in the past and what's been tried and what's been shown to not work and what's been shown to work. So this heritage is very important, and particularly for people that live in a secular age and don't have, say, a religion as guidance to fall back on. These philosophies are very important. Stoicism faded out in the classical period when Christianity became the state religion under the Emperor Constantine. So that's the early 4th century AD. It made a comeback during the Renaissance and has obviously made a comeback lately. So it's one of the most popular philosophical traditions in the world today. Generally, you're talking about the Western world. Bill Clinton was a big fan of it, for example. The Silicon Valley guys are big on it. And I think if you take it for its practical worth, it's definitely worth dipping into, definitely worth looking at as a source of guidance on these basic issues about how to live a good life, to put it as simply as that.
It's interesting. We've spoken about this for a number of years. Just doing a bit of research, I know you mentioned it, is Stoicism. Where we wake up in the morning, anybody that's got social media, they'll wake up on a Monday morning and they'll see this lovely quote from somebody that means nothing. And it just seems almost arrogant, flippant words kind of that are put out there until we actually investigate and explore the depths behind them. Is there a risk that is kind of seen as shallow nowadays, or is just kind of background noise without the understanding?
So if you were to read Meditations as a whole, you will be reading through it and you'll find those quotes that you often see coming up on Facebook pages or in your social media, or being promoted by various people who say, well, here's Stoicism, why don't you join in? I would not bother with any of that, to be honest. I'd just read the book. If Marcus Aurelius was here right now, he'd say, forget the quotes, nice slogans for T-shirts, just read the book and follow the method, which is to be self-reflective and to understand the basic principles. Now, don't get me wrong, Stoicism is a systematic philosophy, and it is serious stuff, but unless you're a student of philosophy, let me offer an example. So, for example, that's Wittgenstein's famous book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, one of the great books of philosophy, particularly in the 20th century. But just to make the point, I don't know if you can see this terribly well, but I'll try and hold it up to the camera. And you see all the symbols there? So the book is written sort of like a mathematical treatise. It's not a weekend read. Unless you're a professional philosopher or a serious student of philosophy, you won't try and digest that book. It would take years of education before you could even read it. But there's no doubt that it is one of the great books in the history of philosophy. The introduction's by Bertrand Russell, who's not famous for flattering too many people, but his introduction is very, very flattering of the book. So Stoicism does have that deep substance to it. But for somebody who's not a student of philosophy and not a professional philosopher, just read the book and just take it on board for what it is. You don't need to understand the compositional technique of the 1812 overture to enjoy that piece of music and to take something of significance from it. And you don't need to understand the deep technical aspects of Stoicism as a philosophy to get something useful from this book. So my view would be read the book and avoid the T-shirt slogans, and don't fall for the idea that people who are promoting their knowledge of Stoicism as somehow being profoundly philosophical, et cetera, that's a technical area for professional philosophers to look into. But if you read the book and follow his method, you'll definitely get something from it. Something worth.
I'm definitely curious on this. We're talking about a Roman emperor.
Yep.
And behind the Stoicism is basically be a good person, be in harmony with everything around. Yet the Roman Empire wasn't always maybe known for being in harmony with what was around it, and being potentially very brutal. Is there some kind of conflict with that?
There's a problem with looking back into history and projecting our current values onto the way people lived their lives, say 2,000 years ago. It's called presentism. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because we can look back at periods of history. For example, we can look at Nazi Germany and say, we would never, ever countenance behaving that way. So that's perfectly fine. But if you look at the Roman Empire, in one sense, it gets a bit of a bad press because there's maybe 70, 100 million people. The dominant language is obviously Latin and Greek, but it's highly linguistically diverse. It's highly culturally diverse. There's actually a lot of social mobility in the Roman Empire, both up and down. Yes, there was slavery, and in some periods and in some particular places, and it could be very, very harsh, but slavery in the ancient world was really a social class. It's best understood as a general social class. Some of the harsher aspects of it, of course, we wouldn't tolerate today, and thank goodness we don't tolerate it anymore. There were successful women in the Roman Empire. So what we tend to have is this, I think, overly harsh view of the Roman Empire. There is an awful lot about it that is surprisingly modern and surprisingly fair if you look at it. Now, I don't want to overdo that, because if you go to Rome today and go to the Colosseum, the last time I was there, we were given a wonderful tour by a young man from Rome, and I asked him his view of the Colosseum. He said he hated it personally because so many people were killed there. Again, those statistics are overblown, but certainly it was a period in history where there were exercises in brutality that we simply wouldn't tolerate today, and neither should we. So there is a bit of a contradiction there, and Aurelius himself tolerated persecution of Christians, for example. So there is that. But again, it's very difficult to imagine how you could be the Roman emperor and have the respect of such a broad community of people without being able to demonstrate that you were tolerant of other people and that you were open to reason, open to logic, and capable of making good decisions. So there is a bit of a contradiction there, but I'll just add one other thing here. Stoic ethics don't necessarily point to what we would call in the modern period virtue ethics. So setting out moral absolutes, for example. So for instance, again, just to take the obvious historical example, the 10 Commandments, which comes obviously from the Old Testament. Commandment 6, if you're a Catholic, is thou shalt not kill. So there's an absolute moral prohibition on killing another person, unless it's in self-defense, for example, yeah? So you're entitled to not allow someone to kill you, but that's a moral absolute. Stoicism doesn't have moral absolutes in it. It's more of a process ethics, as it were. So thinking through in the circumstance and making the best rational, reasonable decision that you can.
How did so it's more practical, which kind of almost brings us back into kind of modern life. We're constantly looking about how do we do things practically rather than just set around a set of rules. I think that's probably something that's been pushed back upon over the last kind of few decades, that people don't really like rules, but they like guidance. So just so I'm clear, the meditations, his journal, his insights, he didn't really come out until after he died, because
it wasn't published. The history of the publication of it is a little bit sketchy. So it first appears in the written record in terms of commentary being made on the text itself about 200 years after his death. And then it is really popularized during the Renaissance. So the Italian Renaissance, just to pick that as an example of the European Renaissance, the notion is that you return to the classical heritage and there's a rebirth of understanding the classical heritage. It really gets a boost then. And then obviously when the printing press comes in, it's one of the short classical texts. And then it becomes part of the European university system as one of the foundational texts to read. So Stoicism is a philosophical school. We've got Zeno of Cyprus. Then you could add probably about another 50 names. And Stoicism goes through various different schools. But on that honor roll of named contributors to Stoicism as a systematic philosophy, Aurelius is on that list. So he's that significant a thinker. So that's really the arc of the publication and the general reception of the ideas in the book into the canon of Western thought. Couple hundred years after his death, picked up during the Renaissance. Because it's got to be remembered that when Christianity is made the state religion of Rome, there's your set of ethics and values provided to you by the state through the religion. And so, as it were, the need for Stoicism is moved to the side, and it is delegitimized because it becomes a Christian empire. So Christianity takes over that role and pretty much dominates the scene for the Western world, at least anyway, all the way through to the Renaissance, all the way through the collapse of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, etc., and only gets a revival around about the 14th century, around about then.
Okay, so to have an influence as an emperor without kind of his writings or his insights coming out, I'm trying to not just kind of play this, but was this about creating a culture around him of this is how we should be rather than kind of setting the rules? So it was more around the actions and how he was.
He was, as an emperor, if you look at the historical writing about his period of rule, it appears rather uneventful in terms of him as a person. So he's quite low key. He doesn't create a cult of personality around himself. There's no attempt to deify him as the emperor. Now, it's a formal part of the Roman system that when an emperor dies, they'll be cremated, their ashes will be returned to Rome, they'll be put in the appropriate place, and the Senate will pass a resolution elevating them to the status of a god. One of the roles of the Roman emperor was to be the bridge between humanity and the gods. So the emperor would be the key participant in the bigger religious events throughout the calendar. But he was very low key. He did not live a life of luxury, for example. He lived a very simple life. When he was out on military campaign, he would sleep on just a soldier's camp bed, for example. So he just simply wasn't interested in that part of, as it were, the pomp and circumstance of being an emperor. The irony, of course, with Aurelius, he dies in 180 AD, is that he ignores the good counsel of the previous emperors, and rather than adopting as his son the next most suitable person, he actually appoints his own son to take over the role, Commodus. And Commodus, with Nero, Caligula, probably the top three tyrannical emperors. And that all ends in disaster. Commodus is narcissistic. He has a cult of personality. His rule is capricious, puts so many people offside that eventually they poison him and try and kill him in his bedroom. And ironically, in one of these little delicious ironies of history, the poison doesn't work, so they send in a wrestler to finish him off by strangling him to death. And of course, the wrestler's name happens to be Narcissus. So the narcissist gets it in the neck from Narcissus himself. And a lot of people will argue that the fall of the Roman Empire begins at that point, with the handing off from the philosopher king, the epitome of the good emperor, to his own biological son. Now, the formal collapse of the Western Empire is about 456, but a lot of scholars would argue that really, because that's the end of what's called the Pax Romana, which is from Caesar Augustus through to the death of Aurelius in 180. So you can be the philosopher king, but it doesn't mean to say you're going to make all the right decisions, because his final decision was an unquestioned disaster. It really was.
I was actually just going to ask that. It's really interesting. You're talking about how you kind of downplay that he led a simple life. We would look on that, if there was a leader doing that at the moment, we would look on that as being a great trait of someone, whether it's within business or politics or something like that. So apart from Commodus, did he have any other blind spots? I mean, he must have done.
Not that we really know of, to be quite frank, because again, the history in terms of treating the detail of his biography is a little bit sparse. Perhaps on the basis that there just wasn't that much to report. There's not a lot of gossip about him, for example. I mean, my favorite quote actually from the whole book is, I think it's paragraph 5, page 1, the last 4 words, never listen to gossip. So he wasn't one for gossip himself. I mean, the point he's making is you'll hear gossip, it's just a normal human thing, but don't act upon it. And so he wasn't given to gossip. He wasn't given to court intrigue. So if you're going to take an emperor to build a dramatic plot to make a Hollywood blockbuster, you're not going to pick Marcus Aurelius. He was the safe pair of hands, as it were. The thing that really guided him, because imagine how many decisions he's got to make, just the administrative load. Sure,
Yeah.
he'd have minions yet, but his daily routine there is a bit of a record of him complaining about his daily routine of having to write up to 30 letters a day, for example. Now, these letters are not going to be about inconsequential things. So he's going to have to carefully think through the decision that he's making and all the different domains of decision-making, diplomacy, military matters, handling a plague, currency devaluation, all these sorts of things ultimately fall to him because he's an autocrat. Yes, there's the Senate, which persists throughout the empire, but it's very much a junior partner in terms of the exercise of power. But again, he has to deal with the Senate and keep them on side. It's a big, unruly body. It's like 600 people in the Senate, and they have to be kept in line as well. But it's the logical way of thinking, which I think is the real key. And that applies in two domains that are pretty clear from his life story. One is, and again, I've used the phrase, the domain of action. So what is the problem he's looking at? And that way of being able to think through an issue, one of the keys to that is conceptual clarity, is being absolutely crystal clear with the meaning of the words that you're using. And we do have a bit of a modern habit where words and their meaning tend to go in opposite directions. There's a lot of insincerity, I think, in a lot of modern communications. I'll give you an example, actually, which I was just looking at the other day for another reason. There's this book here, which is fairly well known by the American philosopher, psychologist Sam Harris, called Free Will.
He lift up just ever so slightly. So there we go.
Yeah, Free Will.
Thank you.
Which I think is 2012, and has sort of been received as a well-written book. And Sam Harris's essential argument is we don't have free will. So if you can imagine, to put the argument at its highest, the Big Bang happened, some particles appeared, and if we could count all those particles a couple of moments after the Big Bang, everything's determined after that, including you and I having this conversation right now. So we don't have free will. It's a deterministic universe, and that's the end of it. I think Marcus Aurelius would cut that book to ribbons really very, very quickly. I mean, the notion of free will, for example, if you say go back to Aristotle, he says nothing about it. And there's a very good reason for that, because the concept of free will is just not a philosophical concept. It's a subject heading, really. And the book really is, if you look at it in terms of what Aurelius would call propositional logic, conceptual clarity, I don't want to be too unkind, but it doesn't reach any great heights. And to me, it's symptomatic of a lot of things in our current public discourse where there's a lot of sloppy thinking goes on. And this was the sort of thing that Aurelius was very, very clear about during his time as the emperor. You can't be communicating to 70, 100 million people, not being crystal clear about what you require, just not only for fairness, but also for good governance. So that's a real theme in his life. And it also goes back to the question of ethics and making moral judgments about issues.
I was just going to say, what do you mean by sloppy thinking?
Sloppy thinking, or for example, and I don't want to pick too much on Sam Harris, the notion of free will. And he uses that as the idea to launch the argument such that you can call it an argument made in the book. Let me try and clarify it a bit. If there is a thing called free will, it would be an attribute of consciousness. So you would first have to begin with the question of what is consciousness? And as soon as you got to that point, you come up against a brick wall because nobody can tell you what consciousness is. So if free will, the argument is it or is it not an attribute of consciousness? If you get to the base and say, well, we don't know what consciousness is, you realize that you can't make a coherent argument about whether free will exists or not. That would be one way of being clear conceptually about the argument that you're trying to make. And you see a lot of this in bureaucratic language. I'll give you one example. There's a settlement not far away from here called Mascot. And there was an issue with multi-story residential buildings that started to collapse because the foundations weren't properly built for a whole lot of disastrous reasons. And the New South Wales government provided a response. And I remember I saw this happen live on television. The bureaucrat approached the press pack and was asked whether the buildings were collapsing. And he insisted, no, they're not collapsing. And of course, the follow-up question was, well, what's actually happening? And his answer was that the buildings were moving in a downward direction. We have this real problem with using language in an insincere way. And so this is something that Stoicism as a philosophy, with its insistence on using logic carefully and using language very, very carefully, is very big on. And it's certainly one of the important lessons that can be taken from it.
Let me just come back to something that you said earlier, your favorite quote, and just kind of last 4 words: never listen to gossip. And when we're talking about language, this is interesting. I have this discussion regularly, and I'm talking about like several times a week, that when there's a word like never in there, if we do listen to it, then we've failed. Rather than what I would say this is saying is never listen to gossip because this is what it could do. So we need to lower the bar sometimes. We are going to listen to gossip. But what that's suggesting is if you do it, there's potentially a negative impact. Right? Just like the first principle in How to Win Friends and Influence People is never criticize, condemn, or complain. We know not to criticize, and that's an easy thing to say, but it's not about the criticism. It's about the impact of it and the likely response. And you're kind of not getting somewhere. So I'm curious, when we say that language is such a thing, I always wonder about words like never being put into something which feels almost absolute.
It is an absolute. And I take Aurelius to be meaning there, you're going to hear it. It's just a natural human foible. But don't take it seriously or don't act upon it. Because gossip is person A saying to person B, have you heard about person C? So from the point of view of person B, you're going to act upon it without hearing from person C. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, don't do that. So you will hear it. It's just, most gossip's pretty harmless. Oh, did you hear what Jack did at the pub the other day, et cetera, et cetera. But pernicious gossip is something that Aurelius is railing against there. And let's take your point a little bit further because it's a good one, where the Stoics would say, don't be consumed by anger, don't be consumed by envy, don't be consumed by thinking about what somebody else is thinking about you. These are all natural human emotional responses. So the philosophy is not saying you have to work on your mind to the point where you become some sort of a zombie and blank all that stuff out. It's really saying, don't be consumed by it. Don't overdo it. I think most psychologists would tell you that anger is actually a positive emotion if you know how to channel it, because it can help people push through something and make something happen, or make them insist that something that crosses a boundary stop, for example. So if you're approached by somebody in the street that's behaving aggressively or behaving aggressively to someone else and you want to step in and protect them, a little bit of well-controlled and well-directed anger might be exactly what the doctor ordered. So it's about a balance, and you're quite right that you can't read these philosophical precepts in terms of absolutes, and I'm sure Aurelius would agree with you on that if he was here.
And another great modern philosopher, Johnny Rotten, once said, anger is an energy, when he was Public Image Limited. So, we're coming kind of full circle here. We're coming back to the broicism that we spoke about earlier, or the use of these out of context and without kind of an understanding of what the overall picture is. Because if we turn around and say, never listen to gossip, that's maybe one of those quotes that we see on social media. It means nothing. There's nothing behind it until you kind of dig, or until we've got the mindset of looking at these in a different way.
And if you read, again, just take Meditations, the book of the day, as it were, the book du jour, if you read it from cover to cover, it's not a long book. It doesn't take that long to read. I actually reread the book every couple of years or so. It's just one of those books that I go back to, like go back to Eliot's poetry or read a bit of Shakespeare, et cetera, again and again. You will see that it's very balanced, because there are passages in there where Aurelius is talking about hearing a bit of gossip and then thinking it through and making a sensible decision. Because one of the key things for somebody in the position of an emperor or somebody in the position of managing a large corporation is about, or, some big public institution or a prime minister, is about being able to make sophisticated moral judgments. And I think that's something that we've also lost. I don't think we've lost it entirely, but our ability to think through a moral case in a sophisticated way has been dissipated an awful lot in the culture. So, for example, you'll see people out protesting whatever it happens to be, but they're really just protesting a slogan. They haven't really thought through the moral case. I'll steer away from current political affairs, but we just recently had the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, World War II. So how would a Stoic think that one through? The Stoic wouldn't say, well, it brought the war to an end, therefore it was justified. That's sort of a consequentialist approach, that it worked out for the better at the end of the day, so we were right to do it. A Stoic would say, no, you must think it through before you do it, and you have to make the moral case for actually taking that step. Now, people can debate the history, but I have to say Truman made the right decision, as tough as that is to have to admit, and we don't need to go through the detail, and I know that some people argue differently, but you do see in the arc of the debate about, the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan, that in the immediate aftermath, there was a big reaction against it, including most of the scientists who worked on the project tried to step away from it. But in more recent times, it settled down into a, terrible, thankfully it's never happened again, but it was morally justified. So a Stoic, and a Christian for that matter, and an Aristotelian ethicist would think through the moral case before taking the action. And unless you can make a moral case for something before you do it, you shouldn't do it. But making the moral case for important decisions is, you've got to get below the surface level. You can't just act on the slogans. And if you go to Hiroshima, for example, the memorials that they've got there, it's very, very somber and very, very sobering. But my sense of even the Japanese population generally, that they've come to terms with it as well. I'm sure a lot of them really still feel very, very angry and embittered about it. But that ability to make the moral case for important decisions is something that Stoics are very big on. And we need to be able to get below the surface level with that sort of thing.
I mean, that could be a whole different show. I mean, I personal point of view, and looking at kind of the moral argument up front, could it have been done in a different way? Could were there other options there without kind of the consequence that it did have? Stoicism, how has it helped you personally?
I read Aurelius when I was at university, and being brought up in a secular culture, and not being a religious person, but being aware of the Ten Commandments, and etc. It's always been helpful to me in order to give me a grounding for personal values, standards of behavior, and also that practice of self-reflection, and being prepared always to interrogate your own conduct, which, more often than not, you look at it and you say, well, okay, I didn't do as well as I could have done in that particular instance. And sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable. But I would say that even if you look at the Christian tradition and put yourself into a mindset where you say, okay, I take this seriously, Christian ethics don't encourage that interior self-reflection in the same way the Stoics do. So the Stoics, it's much more analytical than, say, Christian ethics would encourage you to do. Christian ethics is a bit more looking outward towards God and forgiveness and confession, and trying to live up to the absolute moral standards, which I have no cavil. I don't have a problem with that at all. But I think Stoicism gives you those interior resources to be able to do that, to, I don't know, fix your own car, as it were, to use a terrible metaphor. But also the emphasis on being very clear with your thinking to get your conceptual structure right, to make sure that you're actually thinking about the problem in a way that's logical and rational. I mean, I studied informal logic at university, and I sort of lament that that's no longer a compulsory subject for university students. It really should be. You don't have to be an expert in formal logic, which is a highly technical subject, but certainly if I was writing the university curriculum today, rewriting it for Australian universities, I would insist that an introduction to formal and informal logic be in there, epistemology and a couple of other subjects. But again, Stoicism with its hard emphasis on those issues, I've always found very, very useful.
I know this might be oversimplifying it. Again, something we talk about a lot is just lower the bar. Let's be kind to ourselves. When we've got that self-reflection, we can go back, we can readjust. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time.
Doesn't have to be perfect. Absolutely not.
And I do want, it's probably no different now. It just feels now that there is that push to be perfect. There's kind of that focus all the time. There's so much information out there, and it's always a talk about failing rather than achieving something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And interestingly, actually, when I look at behavioral styles, we recognize people's stress points and the almost the offset of their strength. We notice their weaknesses or allowable weaknesses much more easily than we notice their strengths. Much more quickly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's if someone was, is this the place to start? If someone's interested in Stoicism, is this the place to start? Meditations.
I would, there are two really great short books from the classical period that I would look at. And in terms of chronology, Seneca on the shortness of life, which is only about 50 pages. That's a really good read. And he's a Stoic. He's about 100 years before Aurelius. And again, I just want to stress, all I'm suggesting is you read them. Yeah, you don't, so for example, you could take, let's look at another area, say poetry, pick, say, T.S. Eliot's poem Marina, which is about 1930. It's one of the most studied in poems of Eliot's. Literary critics go crazy on it, lit studies. So you can read annotated copies of that poem with hundreds of footnotes, allusions to Shakespeare and the ancients, and it's all in the poem, yeah? Or you can just read it, and it's a beautiful poem with all these arresting phrases in it. And it sounds, on the surface, it's a poem about a marina, about boats, etc., etc. There's a deeper meaning. But just read the poem and enjoy it for what it is. It's definitely a worthwhile exercise. So Seneca, I'd definitely read that one. And Aurelius himself, The other two books, and these sort of have a bit more of a Christian ethics tinge to them, but they are sort of a piece with Aurelius and Seneca, is, of course, Augustine, Confessions of a Sinner. It's not a religious book. It's about a young man from Africa, from Hippo, who's a bit of a rat bag, and he's trying to get his life together. And it's a really good read. It's one of the most honest books that was ever written. I think J.D. Vance, the vice president of the US, sort of cited that as the most influential book in his life. And then there's Boethius, which again has a Christian element to it, but certainly picks up on these themes, which is another one of the great short books from this period. And this is a bit more literary, but Boethius picks up what's become known as prison writing, like the genre of people who are imprisoned and they use their time in prison to write something which becomes very, very influential. This is an incredibly influential book in the history of ideas. Got some great stuff in it, really worth a read, very clearly written. But prison literature goes all the way through history. I mean, so you have Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, for example. Prison Notebooks is one of the most influential books, whether you are a fan of Marxism or not, doesn't matter. It's one of the most influential prison works ever written. So, and Boethius kicks it off with that book, which again, has got some great reflections on the meaning of life and ethics and etc. So they're the four that are sort of a piece. And you'll see the transition from Stoic ethics, not to somebody lecturing you about religion and Christianity, but very practically minded authors talking about the human condition and how we make good decisions and what it means to lead a good life. So they're the four that I'd bracket together.
Thank you, and we'll link all of these in below the video, just so everybody can kind of come into this out wherever they would like, or do a bit more research on the books. Final question, Ted. Final question. We always set that challenge. We always set something we do in the mind. This kind of look at, okay, what do we take away from this? What can we do slightly differently? And I know you've put a bit of thought into this one.
A little bit of thought, yeah.
Go on. What is it? What's today's challenge?
Your point earlier about not getting carried away and sucked in by the slogans is bang on point. Because my point about Aurelius, and I'm sure the emperor's own point would be, don't consume my slogans, follow my method. So habits of mind, clarity of thinking. And one way that I do this for myself, I do it probably once a year, is I take a piece of writing of my own and I interrogate it by putting a grid on it. And the grid comes from none other than George Orwell. In 1936, I think it was, 1946, Orwell wrote this essay, Politics and the English Language.
If you just lower it just ever so slightly, a little bit, there you go. Thank you.
Politics in the English Language, 1946. It's a wonderful essay. I'm going to be bold and say everyone should read it. And it is about sloppiness in the use of the English language. And from his point of view, the importance of that for politics. But it is of more general application than that. And on my printout of it, so it's near the end of the essay, it's only about 9 pages long. It's worth reading from beginning to end. Orwell is a paradigm of clear writing. I try to follow his style in my own writing, like very, very carefully, because he's just the epitome of clean, modern English, which is actually not that easy to do. It's technically quite challenging. But near the end, right near the end, he has 5 rules. He says there are 6, but I'll come back to the 6th in a minute. 5 rules that you should use as a grid to scrutinize your own writing in order to try and improve it. Rule 2, for example, never use a long word when a short word will do, for example, yeah? Or rule 4, never use the passive where you can use the active voice. So swapping subject, object. People can look up what that actually means for themselves. So it's, the mat was sat on by the dog is passive voice, which is just awkward. So the dog sat on the mat is active voice. Just to give you a quick example. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word or jargon if you think of an everyday English equivalent, that sort of thing. Now, this again all sounds like very much just common sense, but this is one of the most influential guides to style in modern English that was ever written. Some people dispute some of the propositions he puts in it. Those people I'd bracket in a category if they don't know what they're talking about. Because Orwell's an absolute master of clean modern English style. And this isn't just a style point, because you'll see if you follow the argument in his essay, which is brilliantly laid out, is that in order to write clearly, you need to be able to think clearly. And if you do those two things, they both work together. So you're going to move closer. Yeah. You're going to move closer. Yeah. You're going to move closer to a stoic, logical, rational mindset by working on your writing and making it come back to you like that. I do it once a year. I pick something that I've written and I put it through that mill. Highly recommend that everyone, if you're interested, have a read of that essay and then go and pick something that you've written. It might just be a long email or a draft of a report or whatever, and put it through that ringer and see how it stacks up and think about how you might rewrite it. It'll help.
I will do. You're going to believe that I'm actually listening. I'm listening to 1984 again.
Are you really?
I am. It's bizarre. We always seem to I think this happened the last time. when we spoke about something, it was very relevant. But yeah, I'm listening to 1984 again. It's really enlightening. I'm listening to it in a different way, completely different way.
This essay, Politics in the English Language, is him working up the idea for Newspeak, which is key to the linguistic control that Big Brother and the party imposed upon Winston and everybody else in 1984, which is scary in the dystopian sense of, because you remember what they're doing is they're taking words out of the language on the basis that if you don't have the language, if you can't have the thought, the action becomes impossible. It's really pernicious.
It's a very, very interesting one to listen to again. It was very popular, obviously, kind of years ago, but just because of the date, and that's why I remember. But again, to me, it's a must listen or must read, whatever you prefer to do.
It's a masterpiece. I think it's the best piece of dystopian fiction ever written. There's some other good contenders, but I'd definitely give that number one. Have you seen the film version with John Hurt in it?
I have, yes.
Yeah, very, very good. Yeah.
Really interesting. We're kind of finishing off in language. Again, something it always feels when we have emotional reactions to things, when we have conflict, when we have that, a lot of the time in everyday life, it's clumsy language more than anything else is done. Not knowing how to kind of express themselves, not knowing how to control that part, rather than anything else behind it. So, Marcus Aurelius and Ted Miller, did you ever think that would happen in one sentence?
No, I didn't.
Listen, but there you go. You're now forever linked. Ted, thank you so much on the challenge. Have a look at the Politics in the English Language essay by George Orwell. We will link all the books below, and I'm going to guess we're going to come up with another topic quite soon.
That's probably going to happen, Graham, yes.
Great to see you again. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.